Yes, thank you. Yeah, again, thank you for all these lectures. And today, like two times before, last Tuesday and Thursday, we have Tobias Hoffmann. I have to stick it to German pronunciation,
Yeah.
who is professor at Sorbonne University in Paris since 2021, and also he's a president of Global Society for Medieval Philosophy, visiting professor at many institutions, for instance, at the University in Leuven and also Catholic University of America, for instance. And also he published books with Cambridge University Press under the title Free Will and the Rebel Angels in Medieval Philosophy. And also he is, as I saw, the editor of or co-editor of Companion to Angels in Medieval Philosophy. That's something that I will get definitely after I saw your CV. Last two times we had lectures on prudence and also in Aristotle and in Thomas Aquinas. As I understood, today we have a lecture on natural law. So, Tobias, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zorn. So, yeah, let's take a look at the lectures. So here's where we're at. We had these two lectures before. Now the third one, the general principles of action, prudence and natural law. So prudence is really the red thread which runs through all these lectures. So practical wisdom, prudence, that comes down to the same thing. I prefer the word practical wisdom when I first present something because prudence can be understood in a reductive way. So, but it's prudence, practical wisdom. We already, some of the things I will speak about today came up already last time. So, in fact, when Aristotle talks about prudence, there is no hint at natural law, and Aquinas, when he talks about prudence in some foundational way, he can hardly resist to speak about what he calls the principles of practical reason, the first principles of practical reason, which are the same principles that are the principles of natural law. So that's what makes the connection to natural law. First principles of reason. So that's that's where we are getting at today. Today I will divide it into three parts. So today the general principles of action. First, I will talk about a very difficult text in Aristotle about practical truth. It's a short text. It's very, as many things of Aristotle, very elliptic. And I will see what Aquinas makes of that. That's going to occupy us for most of the time today, I believe. Then I will see how the question of whether moral virtue can exist without intellectual virtues, how that question, the way Aquinas answers that is in continuation with what he said, how he interprets Aristotle on practical truth, and how he interprets Aristotle on what we saw last time, the gold passage, which I will remind also today, the gold passage of Aristotle that says, the moral virtues make the end right, meaning the goal that we pursue, and then practical wisdom or prudence makes that which promotes the end, the means to the end right. So then this is the second section today, and the third one is I will present you briefly the very famous a passage from the very famous text of Thomas Aquinas, where he connects naturally known first practical principles, in fact, to natural law. So I will not say anything new about this text. I will just it's just interesting to see it in connection with what we are seeing about prudence. Also, because it will be good, as I will repeatedly talk about these naturally known practical principles, because Aquinas talks about those. It will be good to see some of them at work, so which is the last part today. And this very much has to do with general principles of action because, well, um, or rather, not because, before I say because, I should say, even though you would think that prudence doesn't have so much to do with general principles of action, but with particular principles of action. Prudence, Aristotle says, is about experience. It's about the particulars. It's about experience because we need to know the particulars. Why? Because we need to make decisions about our actions, and actions are always particular actions. There don't exist any universal actions. So actions are always individuated by time and space, and by then, from a moral perspective, by intention and by circumstances. So therefore, prudence seems to have mostly to do with particular principles, but here we will see, in fact, today how Aquinas connects prudence to general principles. And the next lecture finally will be how Aquinas uh, continues Aristotle's thought and I think in some way expands on it, deepens it, the way in which and the way in which prudence has to do with particular principles, particular acts. Particular principles we will see are the particular ends that we pursue, but that I will explain more the next time. So let's start with the first section on practical truth in Aristotle first. So I have to give you this passage from actually this is um, I will give the reference later, but it's from book 6, chapter 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle says, I try to go slowly because it's very dense. So he says, as assertion and denial are to thought, so pursuit and avoidance are to desire. So assertion and denial, I say either the sun is shining or the sun is not shining. Okay, so that is has to do with thought, that is in the theoretical realm. But pursuit and avoidance, I pursue the sun if I like to get burned in the sun, or I avoid it if uh, I'm more of the northern countries and northern skin complexion. I avoid the sun because I don't want to be burned by it too much. So you see the difference. The sun is shining or not, assertion and denial. I seek the sun or avoid it. That is has to do with desire. Now he continues. Now, moral virtue is a habit that decides, and decision is a deliberative desire. So that's a very famous quotation, or he says it also elsewhere. Moral virtue is a habit that decides, a hexis pro haeretike, and then in Latin it's habitus electivus. And decision is, I mean, what we can also translate as choice, or then which is in fact the election Latin. Decision, he says, is deliberative desire, meaning it's desire after having deliberated, or it's desire that we have upon deliberation. Meaning, decision is, Aristotle says, is never about ends. I don't, so he says the doctor doesn't decide whether to heal or not. The doctor decides how to heal. So the doctor then has to deliberate whether to heal by uh, administering some ointment, or whether he has to heal through medication or by prescribing a diet. So decision is deliberate desire. I continue the quotation. If then the decision is excellent, the reason must be true and the desire correct, so that what reason asserts is what desire pursues. That's a very central sentence. So what we're interested in is decision because we're interested in virtue, and virtue has to do with decision, he just said in the second line. So if the decision is to be excellent, good, then the reason must be true. So my deliberation has to be correct, for example. What my reason affirms as to be desired has to be true, and the desire also has to be correct. He says so that what reason asserts is what desire pursues. We would have liked, I think, a little more explanation of this. maybe I'll get back to this point that this sentence is a little bit underdetermined, but let me continue so that we see it in the fuller context. So continue. This then is practical thought and practical truth. So here he introduces this notion. Practical thought is nothing, nothing surprising to us. So that's simply the fact that for example, if I have the desire to go to vacation, then I will try to go south to vacation to get more sun exposure than I get in Paris. Then I will go to the south, and that is practical thought, thinking about what I have to do if I want to get um, more sun. Um, the notion of practical truth may surprise us a little bit more, so that there's truth and falsity also in practical things and decisions. But in fact, so this is what he says, and then he continues. And in fact, what I'm most interested in is what follows next. Theoretical thought has its good or bad state in being true or false. For truth is the function of whatever thinks. That's very Aristotelian language here. Truth is the function, but theoretical thought is, well, I gave an example already. The sun is shining, then if the sun is actually shining, then this sentence is true. If I'm saying the sun is shining, but it's not in fact shining, then the sentence is false. So um, yeah, the good state is true or false. Truth is the function of whatever things. So truth function here also, truth is what thinking individuals like human beings, right, want to accomplish. Now, the sentence I'm most interested in, but the function of what thinks about action is truth agreeing with correct desire. So, and nothing further is said. He goes on and goes on to, as the text continues, Aristotle goes on to a new topic. I mean, a new consideration, but he doesn't explain anything more about the sentence. So already he did not explain when he said in the third sentence, if then this decision is excellent, the reason must be true and desire correct. So that what reason asserts is what desire pursues. He didn't tell us whether correct desire is what follows upon correct reason, or whether correct desire is what comes prior to correct reason. Meaning, do I first need to desire correctly in order to reason correctly? Or can I take for granted that I can reason correctly and then my correct desire follows upon what I reason? So he leaves that open. To say that again, he doesn't cut the issue of whether his concern here is that we might have a bias, and so we have to first get our desires in order so that we can reason correctly, we can think correctly, which is what he says very much in book 6 and book 7, even more in book 7 in a way, when he talks about when he compares the incontinent um, with the intemperate person. So the incontinent person, the akrates, the morally weak, who knows what is correct and therefore also wants to do it, but is too weak to do it. The intemperate, who does not have the true sense of what is correct, and therefore who will pursue something that is really bad for him and maybe for others. So here he doesn't tell us whether he's concerned about the fact that first we need the virtues, the moral virtues, in order that we have correct reasoning about practical matters. This will be the topic of the next lecture. So there I will bring in at least one text or a couple of texts where it becomes very clear that Aristotle thinks we need first to have our desires in order so that we can reason correctly. And this may also be what he has in mind in the famous goal passage, where he said that the moral virtues make the end correct, and then more practical reason, or rather prudence, finds the correct means to the end. But then the second thing that I need to comment on here is this last sentence. The function, meaning the ideal state of, just as the function is truth for thinking about theoretical matters, so the function of thinking about action is truth in agreement with correct desire. So what does that mean? I will not make any further attempt to explain Aristotle here, but I will see how Thomas Aquinas explains this passage. So the next slides are going to be from his commentary on the Ethics. And yeah, this is commenting on this very passage, and I'm not giving you the full text, but then giving you the things that are important to understand, in particular the last part of Aristotle's passage. So let's see here. Since then, reason and appetitive faculty concur in choice. If choice ought to be good, this is required for the natural or moral virtue, the reason must be true and the appetitive faculty right, so that the same thing which reason declares or affirms, the appetitive faculty pursues. In order that there be perfection in action, it is necessary that none of its principles be imperfect. But this intellect or reason, which harmonizes in this way with with the right appetitive faculty and its truth, are practical. So here also he starts from the idea that, I mean, he basically just comments in a more or less literal way on Aristotle by saying that, in fact, the choice needs to be right. And then he picks up this idea, intellect, in the last sentence, intellect or reason harmonizes in this way with the right appetitive faculty, which takes up what we saw in the earlier slide, truth agreeing with correct desire in Aristotle. Let me move on to, I mean, so let's see how the text continues. So he continues commenting. It's really, the text is contiguous. It's just the next sentence of what we saw in the earlier slide. Next, at however it is the function. So here he cites the passage from the Nicomachean Ethics he's commenting on. Next, at however it is the function, he explains what the work of the rational soul is in terms of each part. So here, the Latin has for function opus, and so the translation here is work, but it picks up exactly the vocabulary of Aristotle, who spoke about the function in theoretical knowledge and the function in practical knowledge. So he explains what the work or function of the rational soul is in terms of each part. He says first that the work of a good or faulty mind, that is intellect or reason, in the speculative rather than the practical order, consists simply in the true and false, in such a way that what the absolutely true is, it's good, and the absolutely false is it's evil. Maybe I didn't accentuate this correctly. In such a way that the absolutely true is it's good, and the absolutely false is it's evil. To express the true and the false is an essential function of every intellect. So I don't think there's anything very surprising here. It's just the example of earlier. If I say the sun is shining and it is in fact shining, then that sentence is true, and that is the essential function of the intellect to know the truth. The text continues, but the good and the practical intellect is not absolute truth, but the conformable truth that is corresponding to a right appetitive faculty, as has been shown, because on this point, the moral virtues are united. So here he comments on Aristotle saying that the function of what thinks about action is truth agreeing with correct desire. And so here he says this conformable truth corresponding to a right appetitive desire faculty. Let's see what Aquinas makes next with this, because he will now try to understand what this means, this conformable truth corresponding to a right appetitive faculty. So the text continues. However, there seems to be some difficulty here. If the truth of the practical intellect is determined by comparison with right appetitive faculty, and the rectitude of the appetitive faculty is determined by the fact that it agrees with right reason, as was previously shown, an apparent vicious circle results from these statements. Right? So the truth of the practical intellect depends on the correct appetite, and the correct appetite depends finally on right reason, meaning on the practical intellect. We can illustrate this. So the practical intellect determines the truth for the appetitive faculty. The appetitive faculty would be normally the will. But then also the appetitive faculty determines the truth for the practical intellect. And so we are in a vicious circle. As we will see in the next text, this idea of determining the truth can also be explained in terms of is the measure of. So Aquinas now, as the text continues, as we will see in a minute, wants to see how we can avoid this vicious circularity. So the text continues. It's still the text from the commentary. Therefore, we must say that the end and the means pertain to the appetitive faculty, but so in other words, we can desire an end, health, and we can desire the means. Once we know that we should achieve health through an ointment, we can desire the means, search for an ointment, right? So we must say that the end and the means pertain to the appetitive faculty, but the end is determined for man by nature, as was shown in the third book. So that's an extremely important statement here, but I will not say too much about it now before continuing reading the text, but I will pick this up. On the contrary, the means are not determined for us by nature, but are to be investigated by reason. So it is obvious that the rectitude of the appetitive faculty in regard to the end is the measure of truth for the practical reason. So that I desire health, that's certainly a good desire. That desiring health is something that is a convenient desire to have, is determined for me by nature. We may see toward the end of today's lecture a little bit more about how nature determines that. Okay, so, but then that in fact I seek an ointment as a means that that an ointment is an adequate means that is in fact measured by the fact that the end is health. So if the end weren't health, but who knows? I mean, um, saving money, for example. So then I would not get an ointment because it's expensive, perhaps, right? But since health is the end given by nature, then the rectitude, I comment on the last sentence here, then the rectitude of the appetitive faculty in regard to the end, health, is the measure of the truth for practical reason, which practical reason then has to think about how to achieve health. So the text continues. According to this, the truth of the practical reason is determined by agreement with the right appetitive desire. I think now this makes sense, meaning my reasoning is measured by the fact that my reasoning about health is measured by the fact that what I'm trying to achieve is health. But the truth of the practical reason itself is the rule for the rectitude of the appetitive faculty in regard to the means. according to this, then the appetitive faculty is called right as much as it pursues the things that reason calls true. So we can illustrate this. Um, I wish I could have two slides open at the same time, but I will, well, I think I will, the next slide can help us now to picture this. So we are pursuing an end. I gave the example, the end of health. And what the issue is, the issue that is in question is what determines the rectitude of this end. Well, he says in this commentary, the end is given by nature. And then here again, I'm using an error. The error here to be faithful to be close to Aquinas' text, the error here means is the measure of. So the end given by nature is the measure of the means discovered. I mean, the means have to be discovered, right? So the means are not there already. The means discovered by correct reason. So that in fact for health I seek, well, I was given the example of an ointment, but I'm using a different example. For health, I seek, say, to exercise to reduce cholesterol, for example, rather than taking a cholesterol pill to avoid side effects and to increase my overall health. So the end given by nature is the measure of the means discovered. The means discovered in this case is I should exercise. And this then, what this is discovered by reason, this then is the measure of the means desired, meaning that then, in fact, I desire the means. So in this picture, Aquinas obviously says more than Aristotle, because Aristotle did not speak about an end given by nature. In fact, Aristotle, as I said, Aristotle's text is underdetermined, but certainly he doesn't say that, he doesn't bring in the question of the end given by nature. Aquinas discovers that if you don't have something outside of the practical intellect and the appetitive faculty, something that they can latch onto that's outside of them, then you don't get out of the vicious circle of the practical intellect being the measure of the appetitive faculty and the appetitive faculty being the measure of the practical intellect. Um, I want to connect this picture that we see in in particular in Aquinas' commentary to the passage of Aristotle that we saw of Nicomachean Ethics 6:2. I want to connect it back to the goal passage that we saw last time in Aristotle. And so let's take a look at it again. That is the text. Further, we fulfill our function insofar as we have prudence and moral virtue. For virtue makes the goal right, and prudence makes the things promoting the goal right, or the means, right? The things promoting the goal, the means. If we want to also picture this in a diagram, um, we have the moral virtues in the appetitive powers. In Aristotle, this would be the sensory appetite. And then here the error means sets the end for prudence in reason. Okay, yeah. So that's the picture here, right? There's here there is no circularity, and here there is also no natural principle, but we could still ask, how do the moral virtues set the ends for prudence? Where do they get the ends from? Aquinas in the previous passage would have said, well, the moral virtues get the ends from nature, which is also what he said in the text that we saw last time in the previous lecture. In fact, let me not go back to Aquinas' text, but to the way that I illustrated this text by Aquinas. And that is where he talked about natural known principles and reason um, set the end for the moral virtues in the appetitive powers, and only then the moral virtues um, set the end for prudence. Right? So again, in Aristotle, we only had here we have it again. In Aristotle, we only had the moral virtues and prudence. In Aquinas, we have this more complex picture where he has the natural known principles in addition, right? Okay. Well, this was well, let me repeat a slide again that I already that we saw just earlier, the slide that illustrated Aquinas's commentary on the practical truth passage of Aristotle, which was this, right? So again, the end given by nature gives the is the measure of the means discovered by reason, and then the means discovered by reason are the measure for the means desired. Maybe one thing that I should show a little bit clearer is that well, here the error in Aristotle goes from the moral virtue to from the appetitive powers to reason, right? In Aquinas, the error is just the opposite. They first go from reason, naturally known principles, to the appetitive powers, and only then do they go back from the appetitive powers to reason. So I think that's a very important aspect of Aquinas' thought. I talked about it last time. I think, yeah, this was a point we also picked up in the discussion. This idea that Aquinas wants to anchor the appetite in something that is not just well, indifferent or random or even more than that. Aristotle would not have thought neither it's indifferent nor random, but Aquinas wants to eradicate the appetitive powers, the truth of the appetitive powers, the practical truth. He wants to eradicate them not simply in cultural um, in cultural settings or in cultural practices, what a certain society happens to think is right, but he wants to uh, eradicate it into nature so that, in fact, we have even a means to judge whether a certain culture incorporates principles and moral principles well or not. So that is again, yeah, this was just um, now I move on to my second section, which I think will be a little bit shorter and I think for sure will be a little less complex, I hope, because basically now what Aquinas does in the next text is things that we have already seen here, just that he formulates it in a different context. That is the question, um, again, prima secunda of the Summa Theologiae, question 58, article 4. It's actually quite similar to a text that we saw the last time, but you could almost think I'm giving you the same text again when you read it. But in fact, it's not exactly the same. The last time it was 57.5, 57.5. Now we are 58.4. So for those who want to look at the slides at their own leisure, you can see the two together. But let's read this text now. So can moral virtue exist without intellectual virtue? Moral virtue can exist without certain intellectual virtues, for example, without wisdom, scientific knowledge, and art. Recall that art is what we could also translate with craft competence. But moral virtue cannot exist without understanding and prudence. That's very interesting. Um, we will see, we will pick up what Aristotle has to say about this very question. Can moral virtue exist without intellectual virtue? This will be core in the next lecture. Um, we will see there that Aristotle will only say that moral virtue cannot exist without prudence. He does not say that moral virtue cannot exist without understanding, even though understanding in Aristotle, nous, or in the Latin intellectus, the capacity to grasp principles, also for Aristotle. So Aristotle thinks that nous is the capacity to grasp principles. So Aristotle has the notion of understanding. He has it even in the very context of Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, but he does not, unlike Aquinas, say that virtue cannot exist without understanding. Aristotle only says that moral virtue cannot exist without prudence. But in fact, this sentence should not surprise us after what we've seen before, and the connection with the earlier, what the text we just saw earlier will become clear in how the text continues. Moral virtue cannot exist without prudence because moral virtue is an elective habit. We just saw that, right, in Aristotle's quotation, the first quotation we had, and hexis pro haeretike, habitus electivus. So prudence is an elective habit. Habit is, of course, a bad translation in English. Habit, in the sense of hex, is something that is a stable disposition, not not a routine that we have, a stable disposition. So prudence is moral virtue is an elective habit. That is a habit that affects a good act of choosing. And two things are required for a good act of choosing. And now he will give us these two things. The first is that the act of intending the end be good. And this is affected by moral virtue, which inclines the appetitive powers toward a good that is consonant with reason, that is toward a fitting end. This is what Aquinas takes straight from Aristotle's gold passage, which we just saw again today, right? The intending the good end is affected by the moral virtues because Aristotle says the moral virtue makes the end right. Okay. So in temperance makes the end of acting temperately right. Courage makes the act of acting courageously right. Generosity makes me want to act generously, and so forth. Okay. So that is the first of the things that are required for an act of choosing to be good. The second is that the man, the human being, uh, correctly perceive the means to the end. And this cannot happen except through reasons correctly deliberating, judging, and commanding. And this is what was explained above. This, as was explained above, pertains to prudence and the virtues joined to it. Hence, moral virtue cannot exist without prudence. So that again is entirely within the goal passage of Aristotle. The moral virtues make the end right, prudence makes the means to the end right. Okay. The text continues, and as a result, and this is what is new here with regard to Aristotle, and as a result, it cannot exist without understanding either. For it is through understanding that one has cognition of naturally known principles, both in speculative matters, we could have said in theoretical matters, and in matters having to do with action. Hence, just as in speculative matters, right reason presupposes an understanding of naturally known principles, insofar as it proceeds from those principles, so too with prudence, which is right reason with respect to what can be done. This is something very unlike Aristotle, and this is not a judgment statement, it's simply a matter of fact that um, Aristotle very much has the idea of theoretical principles, speculative principles, first principles. So all of Book Gamma is about those principles, about the principle of non-contradiction, for example. If we deny this, we can no longer think anything. There are other principles, theoretical principles. I think I mentioned briefly one that also Aquinas picks up in this context when he gives a certain example. The whole is larger than its part. It's the first principle of geometry because if I'm unclear about what a whole is or what a part is, and if I don't know that a whole is larger than its part, I will have a hard time to do geometry. Okay, so theoretical principles are nothing surprising from an Aristotelian point of view. But these practical principles, which are also naturally known principles, meaning they are known, we cannot help but assent to them. Elsewhere, he says they are per se note, which means they are self-evident. Once I know the terms, I cannot help but assent even to practical principles, which we will see, in fact, toward the end of the lecture, which is, for example, the good is to be done, evil is to be avoided. So, in the word, for Aquinas, he pairs theoretical first principles with practical first principles. Practical first principles, in the sense in which Aquinas understands them, were unknown to Aristotle. Why? Because, as we will see, for Aquinas, practical first principles take the form of a proposition. I already gave the example. Good is to be done, evil is to be avoided. Or elsewhere, God is to be obeyed, or one should not harm anybody. So, this is then right. And this is also the reason why we need understanding and um, not only prudence in order to have more virtue, because with understanding, we have the ultimate foundation in first practical principles, which are the criteria then for whether my choice, my virtuous choice, is in fact right or wrong, meaning this was not well put. So whether the choice I want to do, whether it is actually a virtuous choice or not, this will be determined by prudence, but also by understanding through through the grasp of these naturally known first principles. We can now turn to the last part of my lecture. In fact, these naturally known principles, naturally known practical principles in Aquinas. And here, as I said, I will only read a passage and comment on um, from this very famous text by Aquinas on of Prima Secunda 94:2, which asks, does the natural law contain many precepts? And then Aquinas would say, in one sense, it contains one precept, but in another sense, it contains many. There's one precept which is the master precept, I could say in my own language, which is in fact this precept: the good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. Let's see, in fact, the text. I will not give you the whole text, but only then the parts that where he comes to explaining these practical principles directly. So the text then reads, the first principle and practical reason is what is founded on the notion of good, which is the notion the good is that what all things desire. Here he picks up the very first sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics: the good is what all things desire. So that is, we cannot define the notion of good because it's too it's too general. It's, in fact, in Aquinas's language, it's a transcendental. So there's nothing. Transcendentals are so general that that you cannot find a genus that is a higher genus and then a specific difference to define it. So, but then you can describe it at least. The good is what all things desire. And then he continues, therefore, the first precept of law is that good ought to be done and pursued, and that evil ought to be avoided. So that is what I call the master principle, the master precept. And it's for Aquinas, this is a principle that is known by itself, which is so self-evident, which is clear from the text that I did not give you, so that precedes this passage, which would have been too complicated to go through in all detail. So this master principle then, the good ought to be done, evil ought to be avoided. I continue reading. All the other principles of the law of nature are founded upon this principle, so that, namely, all the things to be done or avoided that practical reason naturally apprehends as human goods are such that they belong to the precepts of the law of nature. So once we have this master principle that good is to be done, all we need to know in order to get one level down of a little bit more specificity, even though remaining still very much in the general, is that we fill in the blank for the good. What is the good? We're looking for human goods. So what are human goods? Human goods have to do with human nature. They are different from what would be goods, for example, for angels, since Soren mentioned that I had been working on angels also. Let me say this briefly, but then we will see, in fact, as the text continues, how Aquinas, how he confirms what I'm now saying. So angels, by their nature, they have cognition, but they don't have any body. So the angelic good has nothing to do with seeking help. Seeking health, simply because they don't have a body. Human goods have very much to do with human nature, to which belongs a body. So human goods will have to do also with things like seeking health, but we are body and soul. So human goods also have to do with intellectual goods or the goods of the soul, which are, for example, which are intellectual goods, and knowledge, the truth, but also the moral virtues are goods of the soul. So let me continue the quotation where then Aquinas formulates some of what I just said in a rather technical language, but which is very important. He says, "For since what is good has the character of an end, all the good things can be desired." He just said the good is what all things desire. So good and end go hand in hand. Since what is good has the character of an end, and what is bad has the character of the contrary of an end, it follows that all the things the human being has a natural inclination toward are such that reason naturally apprehends them as good, and thus as things that ought to be pursued by action, and reason naturally apprehends their contraries as evil, and thus things that ought to be avoided. Here, this notion of natural inclination is central. So to find out what human goods are, we need to see what human goods are. To find out, we have to find out what human ends are, meaning what things are worth being pursued for human ends. And those things we can discover through our natural inclinations. I wish and I think all commentators had wished Aquinas had said a little bit more about what natural inclinations are, and in particular how they can be known. But they are what is clear is that there are inclinations toward ends that are not up to us to have or not. And so, in that sense, they go along with what we had seen earlier. The end is given with nature. So, since our body and soul, we have an inclination, for example, for knowledge, in as much as we have a soul, but we also have a natural inclination for health, in as much as we have a body. So, therefore, to find out what the goods are, we need to look at these natural inclinations. And then reason apprehends what is conform to these uh, natural goods indicated by natural inclinations as reason apprehends them as to be pursued or the contrary to be avoided. Let me continue now with the text, because now what follows, in fact, therefore there's an ordering of the precepts of the natural law that corresponds to the ordering of the natural inclinations. A quick parenthesis here. In this text, Aquinas is very indebted to Stoic ideas, and partly he gets even when he talks about these natural inclinations, he gets them directly from Cicero. The text continues, and then we can see, in fact, how this works, how we get down to a little bit further precepts, because the question was, does the natural law contain many precepts? The answer is yes, it contains more than just this one master precept. So let's see. First, man has an inclination toward the good with respect to the nature he shares in common with all substances, namely, insofar as every substance strives for the conservation of its own esse, its own being, in accord with its own nature. And but what belongs to the natural law in light of this inclination is everything through which man's life is conserved, or through which what is contrary to preservation of his life is thwarted. So here's what, for example, the precept seek health, or rather act, um, live healthily would fall under this precept. And also, um, do not take your own life or do not take anybody else's life, has falls under this this very first, well, this very first principle that is just under the master principle, meaning everything that that is for the preservation of life should be pursued, and the contrary avoided. So that is based on the natural inclination toward the good that we have to conserve our own being, which is a very general, our own existence, which is a very general, of course, desire. But then, second, the human being has an inclination toward certain more specific goods with respect to the nature that he shares in common with other animals. Accordingly, those things are said to belong to the natural law, which nature teaches all animals. That is the union of male and female, the education of offspring. So this language is a little bit strange for us, but here he cites, I think it is Ulpian. I'm going by memory. So he cites the uh, those authors that then went into the tradition of canon law, which is also very much behind this uh, this development of natural law. So, a natural inclination we share with all animals, which is, for example, uh, perhaps the preservation of life. Well, that was the previous one. But then here, this is about the propagation of life, for example. And the inclination we have by nature is not simply to propagate life, but to propagate good life. So, in other words, not only to have children, but then if we have children, also to educate them. And so from there, Aquinas, not in this text, but for example, in the Sentences commentary, developed such ideas like marriage should be indissoluble because it gives a setting that is most proficient for the education of the offspring. And then third, man has an inclination toward the good with respect to the rational nature that is proper to him. For example, the human being has a natural inclination toward knowing the truth about God and toward living in society. Accordingly, those things that are related to this sort of inclination belong to the natural law. For example, that one should avoid ignorance, that he not offend the others with whom he has to live in community, and other such things related to this inclination. For example, I mentioned several times you should not harm anybody or you should not offend anybody. This would fall under this inclination to live together in community, whereas things having to do with knowledge of the truth and therefore avoid ignorance, but also do not lie. Those precepts would be rooted in this inclination toward knowing the truth, and um, they are natural principles in as much as, in fact, as the natural inclination that indicates the goods that are sought are, in fact, natural inclinations, and also in as much as they are rooted in the self-evident master principle that I said, the master, yeah, master principle, master precept. The good is to be done evil is to be avoided. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention.